cholesterol in many cases is not as predictive as we would like. People say you have to have inflammation in order for ApoB to cause a plaque. You do not. And cholesterol, when it disagrees from particle number, never predicts events. So that's an inconvenient truth. LDL in its native state does not immediately incite processes that lead to a plaque. Could it be the case that people on a statin with a low particle number still have events? Yes.
Cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death for humans. So today we talk in depth about what causes this condition. Cholesterol. Is it relevant? Is it a good marker? Is it a bad marker? Inflammation. What role does it play? Can we get heart disease without pre-existing inflammation? How do lipoproteins end up inside the artery wall in the first place? Do we need damage to the wall in order for them to sneak in? Can we stop this process altogether? Today we cover all of these questions and a lot more. Our guest is Dr. William Cromwell, board-certified clinical lipidologist and fellow of the National Lipid Association with 3 decades of experience diagnosing and managing lipoprotein and metabolic disorders. Dr. Cromwell heads the Lipoprotein and Metabolic Disorders Institute. He is founder and chief medical officer at Precision Health Reports, and he is also a professor at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. He has published extensively on lipid physiology and metabolic disease. So here's my conversation with Dr. Cromwell. Enjoy. For, let's say, someone who's listening who hasn't consumed a lot of information on cardiovascular disease and ApoB, all this universe, how do we explain what causes plaque and what causes atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease for a layperson?
Yeah, so let's kind of start with the fact that cholesterol has something to do with it, and then unpack why, because that's really the way this came to us. It was in the late 1800s that there was the observation cholesterol is in plaque. So we don't know how it got there. We don't know what it's doing there, but a plaque has a lot of cholesterol in it. That was Antichoff and researchers that were just describing what they observed in a plaque. And that led to a whole sequence of experiments to try to understand what the cholesterol was doing there and how it got there. It became pretty clear that it wasn't made locally. It wasn't the case that we were just manufacturing cholesterol in a plaque by itself, but it wasn't clear how it got there. And so there were a lot of different ideas. One idea was that cholesterol, being a fat, would not dissolve in water, which is what blood mostly is water. So it would have to be transported somehow. Perhaps it would be transported by being associated with proteins in the blood, like albumin or other proteins. And while that had a good hypothesis to it, it didn't really work out. And then it wasn't until the 50s that Goffman and Linegan were able to characterize that there were things called lipoproteins that were responsible for moving cholesterol and triglyceride in the blood. And a lipoprotein particle can be thought of very much like a tennis ball. It's spherical. It's got a hollow core. The outside is very water friendly, and the inside is very fat friendly. Being fat friendly means you're water reverse, so you're hydrophobic. So a hydrophobic interior is where the fat stuff stayed. And then the outside of the particle was phospholipids, free cholesterol, and proteins. And that's basically the architecture that allowed this tennis ball-like entity to move cholesterol and triglyceride around. And in trying to figure out, well, how many different kinds did we have and what made them unique, that's how we got to these letter names of LDL, low-density lipoprotein, HDL, high-density lipoprotein, and so on. So we hang up the descriptive term for the particle, the LDL particle, the HDL particle. And over time, we've forgotten that what we're really talking about are particles. We've kind of become lazy in calling it cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is the cholesterol in an LDL particle. HDL cholesterol is the cholesterol in an HDL particle, but now we just say LDL. And because cholesterol is the most common way we measure that, we have equated cholesterol with LDL, and we've equated cholesterol with HDL. And we do so in a way that creates a little bit less understanding. I don't think it was intentional, It was just because we could measure cholesterol and triglyceride most easily, that became the way we talked about it. But from just our conversation so far, you've taken away the idea that cholesterol doesn't float in blood on its own. It's inside a carrier, and the carrier gets a letter name. Okay, we got that. What we haven't talked about yet is the fact that the particle that carries cholesterol around contains different amounts of cholesterol over time. It's much like having a glass of water that is poured for you at the restaurant. It starts out with a certain amount, but as you drink, it goes down. So the amount of water in the glass is not constant. And for various reasons, the amount of cholesterol in a particle is not constant. And this is the problem. If it were always constant, then there would be a very good proportionality between how much cholesterol you measure and how many particles are doing the carrying. And that would be very convenient. We could say LDL quantity is well approximated by cholesterol. And most people believe that to be true. Most people have never had a conversation to even think why it wouldn't be true. But the short answer is it's not true. And as a result, we have this issue where you can measure the carrier, the particle, or you can measure what's inside the particle, the cholesterol. 2 points of reference. If these 2 points of reference agree with each other, they're interchangeable and it's easy. If they disagree from each other, then you have to ask more questions. Which one is a better indicator of what's there? Which one is a better representative of plaque formation, heart attack, stroke, cardiovascular risk? And what we know to be true is that the particle is what interacts with the wall of the artery. The particle is what is involved in plaque formation. And the number of those particles drives that phenomenology. The more bad guys you have, the more risk you have over time. So in my world, LDL is a particle, and knowing how many you have is very important. If cholesterol does not agree with particle number, if my particle number is high, my cholesterol is less than expected, cholesterol does not predict future heart attacks, strokes at all. Risk always tracks with particle number. Conversely, if I have a low particle number and a high cholesterol, risk is low, even though the cholesterol is high. Now, this disagreement has a fancy name, concordance and discordance. Concordance is agreement between two things that measure the same entity, and discordance is disagreement between two things that measure the same entity. So if I'm measuring LDL, the particle, and the cholesterol and particle number agree, they're concordant, either one works equally well. If they disagree, they're discordant, risk always tracks with particle number. No exception in any literature to that statement. So that begins to tee up the controversy that many of your listeners are trying to figure out. Does cholesterol predict cardiovascular disease? Well, not always. So if cholesterol isn't a good predictor, does that mean that lipoproteins don't matter? No. It means that we have to ask another question. Does the number of particles predict well? Yes. Does the number of particles predict well even when cholesterol doesn't? Yes. So we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater by observing that cholesterol in many cases is not as predictive as we would like. So we assume that everything related to cholesterol then is less important, and we're looking for other explanations. When in fact, the particles themselves continue to be very important, but cholesterol as a measure of them is imperfect at best, and this leads us many times.
Mm-hmm. One analogy that we've used in videos previously is the check engine light being an indicator that there might be a problem, but it's not perfect. Maybe there's something wrong with the light and the engine is just fine. And sometimes you might have a problem in the engine and the light doesn't come on. So most of the time, if the light comes on, it's a good idea to check, but checking the actual engine is more reliable than relying 100% on the light.
That works. And I think people may be for the first time hearing that cholesterol has that kind of indirect relationship.
Mhm.
And if you think of it that way, that it's giving partial visibility to something, but you need to check it out further, that's a good take-home message.
Uh, this concept of the discordance, from what I remember, 20 to 30% of people in a general population are discordant. Is that about accurate?
Well, it depends on how you read. And there are groups that have looked at large populations and found anywhere from 30 to 50% discordance. And you enrich that as you get into certain types of physiologic problems, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes. This would be the center of the bullseye that would enrich in discordance. And in that setting, you can have up to 70% discordance.
Mm.
So anywhere from 30 to 50 in a general population, up to 70, 75 in a diabetic population. 75% discordance is encountered pretty commonly. So take away from that that it is as likely to be right as it is to be wrong on a good day. And on a bad day, it's more likely to be wrong than it is to be right.
And is it true that the closer to the borderline values you are, the more likely there is discordance? And as you get to more extreme values, very low LDL cholesterol or very high, you're less likely to encounter discordance.
That is exactly right. So at the extremes, both high and low, there's good agreement. And in the middle, it breaks down badly. Now, that's kind of important, not to get too deep in the weeds, but we have medical studies that are done to try to answer the question, how much extra information are we getting from new tests, a new way of measuring something? And there are many ways to do a study, but a very common way is to compare two measures when they're very low versus very high. So if I measured a low LDL cholesterol quartile 1, and I measured cardiovascular events in the highest quartile, and I compared LDL cholesterol low to high, particle number low to high, and I see they perform similarly well, you say, see, there's nothing here. Why would I do the extra test? It doesn't add any extra information. But what we just did was we looked at when they both agree, they give a similar answer. When they both agree, they give a similar answer. And I only looked in the extremes where they are commonly going to agree. So by virtue of only checking the extremes, you miss the story. And since that's the way most epidemiologic trials are at least initiated, we oftentimes haven't done our due diligence to better understand if there's a story there or not. We just did one observation, and for the reason you just said, there's no story there. But you can ask another question, and this question is, when they disagree, is there a one or the other measure which gets it right? So outcomes in the setting of disagreement, or put more formally, outcomes in the setting of discordance, is the only data that can answer the question, does one measure outperform another for the purpose of event prediction? And when you ask that question very specifically, only particle number significantly predicts events. And cholesterol, when it disagrees from particle number, never predicts events. So that's an inconvenient truth. Until we get to that conversation, we really haven't answered the question, why would I check this test versus this test?
Mhm.
It took, in my 30 years of doing this, it took 2 decades to get that to be a point of conversation with people so that we could advance the discussion.
That's what I was going to ask you next, because this is a question that whenever we talk about these topics, a lot of viewers are frustrated that if this is the case, then why am I only getting LDL cholesterol in a basic lipid panel? Why does my doctor, including cardiologists, only talk about my LDL cholesterol? I ask about my doctors about ApoB. They don't even know what it is. Some know what it is, but won't request a test. If there's this discordance in LDL cholesterol as this imperfect guesstimate, why is the healthcare system so insistent on LDL cholesterol, even when the patient brings up ApoB?
Well, there are many different opinions about that, and what you just described is fact, and I see it all the time. I thought a lot about it through the years, and I have my own opinions about it. One opinion is cholesterol was meant to be a simple answer to a complicated problem. Know your cholesterol, know your numbers. High numbers are bad, low numbers are better. This is true of a population of people where you compare a big group to a big group. So if you're looking at just a way to get started, that's not a bad way to kind of tee up the conversation. And many times, some of the generalities in medicine are designed to just get people started in the right direction. And so that's not a wrong statement. However, people in a group are individuals and they are highly variable, very heterogeneous. And so if your issue is, I want to take care of Gil, I want to take care of somebody as an individual, does that relationship hold enough water for me to be confident? And the answer is no. Okay, so now we have our first problem. Individuals don't follow the rules as well as we would like. Now, what are we going to do with that? In medicine, you have guidelines, and guidelines are the synthesis of a lot of information to get people to the most commonly agreed upon starting point. It's not usually designed to give tremendous detail about all the exceptions to the rule. It's not designed to give you very detailed, discrete information of one individual at a time. And therefore, guidelines say we do this, and that's the starting point. And then they're quiet as to what the next steps are. That's been the history of cholesterol guidelines, right? Now, the problem with that is that you make it sound like that's all you need to know. And then when you get to the point of saying, well, how do I explain somebody who had a heart attack with an LDL cholesterol that isn't high? Well, what else was going on with them? In many cases, they had a high particle number, but a low LDL cholesterol. So they really didn't have a low LDL. They had a high LDL, but your measurement missed it. So now we've got this problem of the cholesterol is not doing the job we hoped it would do, but the issue is it's not bulletproof. It's a poor guesstimate. And then you can construct studies where you can say, okay, let's just put this, under the microscope a little bit. Let's do a study where we are going to give people a medicine, a statin, and we're going to see if people who take that medicine have fewer heart attacks than somebody who doesn't take the medicine. In general, there is a relative reduction in heart attacks for the group treated versus the group that's not treated. Okay, that's a generalization. Now, how does a statin work? A statin works by making more docking stations, we call them LDL receptors, that will grab a particle and take it out of the blood. So the way a statin works is to lower the number of particles. A statin, when you lower the number of particles, will see a general improvement in cholesterol as well, but they don't go one for one. There is a different amount of change in the cholesterol versus the particle number. And when you ask the question, which measure of LDL, particle number, or cholesterol is predictive of heart attacks when you're giving therapy, it's again particle number. Now this is introducing a new conversation, which is going to require a lot of education. Are we up for that? Do we really want to take a big public education campaign and medical education campaign to unpack this vagary to say cholesterol is a guess, particle number is the real answer? If your cholesterol is messed up, do something about it, but don't declare final victory until your particle number is good. It can be that simple. But there are whole careers based on cholesterol. There are guidelines based on cholesterol. And there has been very little appetite to clean up the deficiencies of cholesterol. It's an extra cost to do an ApoB. Is it a lot? No, but it's extra. So all of these things contribute to this, close enough is close enough. Just get them down and they'll do better. That's not where the guidelines are now, but that's where they were for 20 plus years. And now the guidelines, if we want to kind of go in that direction conversation, I think have started to make a better effort to do the right thing one patient at a time. And what the guidelines now identify is there's a lot to individual risk. It's not just your cholesterol. It's not just your blood pressure. It's not just whether you have diabetes or not. It's a lot of clinical information. What other medical problems do you have? It's a lot of potentially risk enhancing factors, 30 plus of them, that individually can adjust your risk. It is looking at validated risk calculators. It's asking, do you have evidence of blockage even without a heart attack? Do you have blockage early on that we can identify with imaging studies? All of these things are now part of a conversation that is supposed to inform individual risk.
Mhm.
Now, that's a lot of extra work. And a lot of people do that as best they can on the fly. Some people do it more effectively than others. But unless you have tools and systems that aggregate that and bring it to an easy to understand point for a conversation, you're not going to see it easily done across the masses. And that's why we started a company called Precision Health Reports, to bring this information together in an easily understood form so that a patient and their clinician can have an informed conversation by all of their parameters they're supposed to know, so they don't have to guess anymore. They can say, oh, this is my degree of insulin resistance. This is my diabetic risk. These are the risk enhancing factors and information that inform what my baseline risk for heart attack and stroke is. These are the numbers I should try to maintain for LDL and ApoB. I should be far below these, and I can track this over time. Now we don't have to guess anymore. Now we can have that fine-tuned conversation. But until we do that, we're directionally correct by making cholesterol go down. We're directionally correct by improving diet and exercise. But a soft landing isn't promised to anybody. Inflammation is something which advances as atherosclerosis matures.
Mhm.
So arterial wall inflammation is very important. It's very important to plaque rupture. It's very important to clinical events. I am not a person who says that inflammation does not matter at all. I'm a person who says inflammation is not where it starts very frequently. Inflammation is added as the process gathers momentum and plaques become more mature over time. All right. So as a result, people say you have to have inflammation in order for ApoB to cause a plaque. You do not. But once we have a plaque, more ApoB feeds the plaque, it grows. And the more inflammation, the more the plaque not only grows, but becomes unstable and leads you to more event behavior. So again, these are keep an open mind. How is the disease progressing? How are these things reinforcing each other? When do certain things show up as problematic? Inflammation shows up as problematic more so after a plaque has been identified than before a plaque has been identified.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean, though, that if you have high inflammation, you don't have a consequence. Rheumatoid arthritis, good example. Chronic psoriatic arthritis, good example. Chronic inflammatory states have a lot of plaque associated with them because that is not a state which leaves the arteries as intact as when they started.
More general question pertaining to that is damage to the wall. There's this idea that you need a tear in the wall or a hole in the wall for particles to get in. And we've touched on transcytosis a little bit in previous videos. Maybe we can get your view on. My understanding is that that's how particles get into the intima, into the artery wall, at least in the beginning. Certainly, if there isn't overt damage, there can be more influx, but that damage is not necessary as a precondition. Is that correct or no?
Correct. You do not have to have injury for injury. Transcytosis is a common way that ApoB-containing lipoproteins move from plasma to the subendothelial space. So the artery wall has a layer of cells called the endothelium. It's a single cell layer thick, and you have to move through that to get into the area under the endothelium and the wall of the artery called the subendothelial space. And moving through by a vesicle called transcytosis is the means by which you do that. Now, you can also physically wiggle between the cells in gap junctions. And so you can wiggle between, that's a thing, but it's not real common. There's transcytosis, that's much more common. And then there is endothelial damage, which makes entry even easier. But you can get entry without damage, right? So all three are true. The model which I think best accommodates all the data is called the response to retention model that Dick St. Clair came up with many decades ago. And the idea was that you get in by some mechanism, yes. But is it the case that once you're in, you're going to stir the pot and cause a problem? The answer is no. So certain types of ApoB particles in their native state are not very atherogenic. LDL in its native state does not immediately incite processes that lead to a plaque. But because the ApoB protein can be bound to substances in the wall of the artery and get stuck, retained particles then hang around and become oxidized, modified in a way that now they start the process of plaque formation. So you have to get in, number one, you have to be retained, number two. And once you're retained, then processes have to occur, number three, that modify you to rev the engine of atherosclerosis. Now that is true for LDL. It is also true that other ApoB particles are bad from the get-go and do not require extra modification. This is true of the triglyceride-rich remnant particles. The remnant particles, particle for particle, are worse. They are more atherogenic. Once they get stuck in there, it's immediately game on, and they're immediately contributing to plaque formation. So it is true that there are worse things than LDL. It is also true that they typically are present in low concentration, and therefore we don't have to deal with them very often, thank goodness. But if for some reason there are more than we would normally encounter, and we get lots more going in than we normally would, that is more than sufficient to drive plaque and vascular disease. And the working example of that is a condition genetically called type 3 dyslipoproteinemia, or dysbeta-lipoproteinemia. What happens there is the body can't get rid of these intermediate types of particles between a VLDL and an LDL. So VLDL is progressively metabolized into LDL, which is cleared by a receptor. Well, what happens if you're doing this and suddenly you get stuck? And these triglyceride-rich remnants don't get converted. They don't get cleared. They just accumulate. Now we have an accumulation of these bad guys. They get into the wall of the artery, and they immediately start to misbehave and cause plaque. That's a thing. That's a real thing. And there are people out there who rightly identify that there are triglyceride-rich atherogenic particles that can be very problematic that we should not forget about. That's absolutely true. Thankfully, we don't encounter that as commonly as we encounter traditional LDL in high quantity that gets retained. That's also why it takes time for particle retention to translate into plaque formation. It's not instantaneous. However, you give me a similar quantity of remnants, that can be much faster in causing disease than simply LDL. So all of these observations are true, but we have to ask the practical question, what are we commonly encountering? We're commonly encountering LDL ApoB. Now, if you clear LDL particles, say with a statin or with medications, does that mean that all ApoB particles are similarly reduced? No. And could it be the case that people on a statin with a low particle number still have events? Yes. And can we learn something about what might be causing those events despite having a low ApoB and they're on a statin? Well, we looked at that in the Jupiter study, and what we found was increased number of triglyceride-rich remnants were significantly predictive of people who went ahead and had heart attacks, even though their LDL went down. The remnants were not similarly reduced. And for those people who continued to have remnant elevations, had increased events. Right. So this gets to some of these newer learnings that should we not care about triglyceride? Should we care about triglyceride? Should we care about remnants? Yeah. Is that true for everybody? No. Oh, okay. So now it gets more complicated. Now I'm doing the right thing for the masses, but there are some people who still have a problem that I haven't adequately identified or managed. And that's the next levels of lipidology. That's kind of the brave new world of, and what do we do for them? Right? Well, we either have to target those particles somehow, or we have to mitigate their effects somehow. And that's a whole area of active research that we don't have a complete answer on yet.
Mm-hmm. Do we know why lipoproteins get into the artery wall in the first place? What's the function of transcytosis?
So it's actually interesting that we have two different processes taking place with cholesterol metabolism. One is the homeostasis to maintain normal physiology. We have to have cholesterol to be alive. If we did not have cholesterol, our membranes would not have the proper fluidity. We would be dead. So it is obligatory for life. Anything that's obligatory for life is very redundantly programmed in us so that we make and we manage and we transport and we do things that are important so that we don't put ourselves at risk. Every cell within the nucleus is able to make cholesterol on demand. So that's just the way we're physiologically programmed. The other interesting thing is if you ask the question, well, where does most of the cholesterol in our body reside? The answer is in cell membranes. Cell membranes are the repository for cholesterol, and it's some of the cholesterol in membranes is fixed. It cannot be moved. It is there for fluidity purposes. Other cholesterol in membranes is highly mobile, and it can be used to come into the cell for purposes or stored back in the membrane. So we have this kind of reservoir of cholesterol that's always available to us. And if we get behind or we need to supplement, we can make LDL receptors. We can grab LDL particles. We can pull them into the cell. We can take that cholesterol to backfill places where we're deficient. So part of transcytosis is just the way that we are transiting, physiologically moving around cholesterol. But the primary purpose of LDL particles is to transport cholesterol to the liver. That's its primary purpose. By doing that, we're maintaining the normal physiology. But if it's around for long periods of time and our quantity is high, it will transcytose into areas that are not its principal target. And as we transcytose, okay, I'm in here. I'll grab some cholesterol and I'm going to get out of here. I don't belong here. I'm going to try to get out, right? And as LDL is getting out, it's like a waiter who comes to you, takes your order, goes back to the kitchen, gets your meal, brings it back to you, goes back to the kitchen. The waiter doesn't stay at your table for the rest of the evening. The waiter has a job to do. He's entering, he's leaving, right? But in this analogy, if the waiter gets stuck at your table, that's a different issue. He's not doing his job anymore. Now he's stuck at your table. LDL that gets stuck in the wall of the artery is not doing its job anymore. Now we're stuck and it gets modified. And macrophages say, now you're not supposed to be here. I'm going to eat you. And macrophages that eat lipoproteins become microscopically what looks like a foam cell, like a foamy cell. And these foam cells are the committed step of atherosclerosis. That is where atherosclerosis starts. So if somebody were to say, okay, tell me the exact step which commits you to plaque formation, it's foam cells. If you make foam cells, you are on your way to atherosclerosis. And how do you make fewer foam cells? Don't have the things there that you eat to make a foam cell. If you have less ApoB in the blood, less will get into the wall of the artery, less will be retained, less foam cells will be made. So the reason reduction of atherogenic particles works is because you're not feeding the plaque. And the reason that persistently high levels are problematic is If they're retained in any significant quantity over time, you're going to feed the plaque. So that's not a complete reason for plaque, nor is it a complete solution to plaque, but it's a critical component of why we make plaque, how we can accelerate or slow down or stabilize plaque.
Mm-hmm. So it's a numbers game in a way. There's this ability to transport lipoproteins into the artery wall, and a percentage of those will get stuck. And so the more there are, the more cross and the more get stuck, at least in susceptible people who have that propensity. Some people might be resistant to this process and still get away with having high ApoB, like with any risk factor. But those who have the propensity, if the higher number of lipoproteins is there, then this chain of events takes place and they have more plaque.
Right. And so, the protection of their propensity gets back to our previous conversation. And I have factors that damage my endothelium. Mm-hmm. Now I have more propensity for entry, okay, versus somebody who doesn't have that. So it is the case that these things do play off each other. And I don't want to make it sound like they're not important. Yep. But sometimes the conversation is less about how they all work together and more about I have to have this before I get that. That's a different conversation. And I think if you're strongly of that opinion, it's going to be hard to reconcile the data. And one of the biases that I have is I think everybody's data is valid. Mm-hmm. They don't always agree. So if everybody's data is valid, but they don't always agree, maybe the model of the disease needs to be adjusted to accommodate both observations. So one's not right and one's not wrong. We need to understand the disease better so that we can then understand how it can be true and it can simultaneously be true, but it looks like they're not agreeing. Mm-hmm. And this gets back to, for example, how am I handling the data? Oh, if I don't take anything else into account, size is really important. I take other things into account, number is more important than size. I take other things into account, the numbers of large and small are very similar in their disease risk. So that's not the way that the data are always reported or discussed, but I really don't have too much trouble with varying opinions and data that would say things that look like they're contradictory when in fact I think it's more an explanation of how the data were handled or what other considerations were or were not included in the conversation.
Right. In actionable terms, these physiological processes, we got the transcytosis, we got the retention, the oxidation, the inflammation. In actionable terms, what people have heard is control your blood pressure, control your glucose levels, don't smoke, keep your cholesterol / ApoB in the healthy range, and insulin resistance, avoid that as well, address that. Is there any other way that we can modulate transcytosis specifically or the oxidation post-retention specifically? Is there other ways to stop that? For example, if we have high ApoB, but we stop at transcytosis somehow. Is there a way to do that?
Not yet. So there may be new opportunities as we go. The biggest opportunity is the ones that you laid out, and that is, tune the physiology so you don't overproduce or clear slowly. Tune the physiology so you don't have a high concentration of injurious particles over time. Tune the physiology so that you are eating and you're active and you're maintaining a lifestyle which is supporting of health and not driving you in a direction which results in more insulin resistance, more overproduction, poorer clearance, and associated issues. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at. And the problem is that we have blunt instruments to identify people who are somewhere on the continuum that need improvement. Blunt instrument of how high is my cholesterol? Blunt instrument, is my blood pressure hypertensive yet? Blunt instrument, am I pre-diabetic or diabetic yet? Blunt instrument, how big is my waist? Mm-hmm. All right. Yes, these things can identify people, but long before that gets your attention, there are proximal changes close to the origin of the issue. Am I insulin sensitive or resistant? What's my ApoB? These are things that can give you a much earlier read. And though we haven't touched on it very much, I can do an imaging study of some type and frequently find early plaque I would never know that I had. And
Mhm.
once I have identified plaque, it is game on. I need to shut that thing down before it shuts me down.
Okay, quick summary of all of that. A lot of the risk factors that we've heard about our entire lives, like is my glucose high? Is my blood pressure high? Is my cholesterol high? They're not wrong, but they're very blunt instruments. By the time your blood glucose is too high, you can have years and years of a pathological process going on underneath. Insulin resistance. We covered several ways to assess your insulin resistance recently, including HOMA-IR and others. Your cholesterol level gives you an idea of where you are, but it's a rough estimate. You can underestimate or overestimate your risk by relying strictly on LDL cholesterol. A better metric is ApoB, or a very cheap one that you probably already have, a non-HDL cholesterol, which is significantly better than LDL cholesterol as well. Another thing we learned is that ApoB carrying lipoproteins get inside the artery wall by crossing the superficial layer called the endothelium. If there is overt damage to the wall, that can happen more. The process can be facilitated or accelerated, but we don't need damage for that to happen. There's an active transport mechanism called transcytosis. So we don't need tears in the wall. The value of keeping ApoB in the healthy range is that there's less particles to get into the wall in the first place. Blood glucose levels can also accelerate this transport. So that's another reason to keep our glucose levels in the healthy range. Generalized inflammation can also accelerate transcytosis, and high blood pressure, smoking, and insulin resistance can damage the endothelium and potentiate this process even more. So keeping all of those risk factors in the healthy range minimizes our risk. To leave you with some actionables, here's a recent video on how to lower insulin resistance, and here's one on lowering ApoB. Thanks for watching. I'll see you over there.